Hi, this is Jackie Aguirre. I am back in South Bend, Indiana at law school at Notre Dame, and I am the host of the What's Up Latin America series. And with me, I have Dr. Rios.
Hello, I'm Dr. Dave Rios, a cardiologist here in Kansas City, Missouri.
Awesome. If you could just walk us through like a brief background of who you are, where you come from, just a rough.
I can do that. So I am the youngest of seven children, and both my parents were born in Puerto Rico, but we were all born and raised in New York City. Actually, my mother died in labor shortly after I was born. And the seven of us were then taken in by my aunt and uncle and my grandmother. And so I was raised primarily by my aunt and uncle. Both were Puerto Rican, born and raised in Puerto Rico, and then came to the United States in the late 40s, early 50s. So my aunt that raised me was a nurse's aide, and my uncle that raised me was a janitor in a hospital. And I was born and raised in the Bronx. As I said, the youngest of seven by many years. So my older siblings are, 13, 14 years older than I am. So let's see, I don't know how much detail you want, but I spent my childhood in the Bronx, and I went to public school through junior high school. And then I would say I got what I would consider a huge break. There is a program called A Better Chance, which sponsors kids from the inner city or provides scholarships for kids from the inner city to go to prep schools. So for high school, I ended up going to a pretty, I can say prestigious private boarding school in Connecticut called Hotchkiss. And that, easily was a huge break for me. My siblings told me that if I did well at Hotchkiss, I could pick my college, and they were exactly right. So from Hotchkiss, I went to Harvard for undergrad, and then from there I went to Stanford for medical school. Then I trained at Mass General for internal medicine, University of Iowa after that. And then I've been in practice in Kansas City since 1998.
That is the year after I was born. So I just
There
like to
you
throw
go.
out fun facts like that to age everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. That was nice.
Yeah. So you're Puerto Rican, your family's Puerto Rican. Do you speak Spanish?
Yes, I speak fluent Spanish. My aunt and uncle spoke only Spanish, and my grandma spoke fluent Spanish. So at home, we spoke only Spanish, or I guess Spanglish for me. And then, in school, obviously we all spoke English. But I grew up in the Bronx. I went to a all Spanish speaking, church. And so I am very fluent in Spanish, although I would say that lately I don't feel as fluent as I once was. That I don't use it as much as I used to, but still fluent.
And do you feel a strong connection to Puerto Rican culture, even all this time removed from it?
Oh, 100%. I identify 100% as being, Puerto Rican. I guess I would be classified as New Yorican because I wasn't born in Puerto Rico, but my entire childhood, all my friends, family, we were completely immersed. All our meals were all Puerto Rican food growing up. Rice and beans, and then some meat, very little vegetables. And all the holidays were traditional Puerto Rican holidays, and so yeah, I feel quite connected, and to this day love going back to Puerto Rico. I have no family in Puerto Rico anymore, but I love going back there, and I try to cook Puerto Rican food and try to find Puerto Rican food anytime I can, and and I get very excited whenever I meet a Puerto Rican here in Kansas City because they're not that many.
Yeah. Puerto Rico has such like an interesting relationship to America. It's, Puerto Ricans are American citizens. I think that kind of goes over the head of a lot of the general population since Puerto Rico isn't technically a state. People don't really grasp that it is still part of the country. Kind of a weird power imbalance going on between us and Puerto Rico. We govern Puerto Rico, but they don't have any representation in in Congress or the Senate or anything that actually matters.
That's very true. And for folks that live on the island, it's a big issue. The politics of statehood versus staying a commonwealth versus independence is a huge political issue on the island. But having said that, growing up in New York as a Puerto Rican, the politics of the island were not something that I really was very versed in, or frankly, very concerned with, to be honest. Um, you know, Puerto Rico, the island itself, is obviously heavily populated, but in terms of density of Puerto Ricans, New York City probably had more Puerto Ricans than the island does, and now that's probably shifted to Florida. But so the neighborhood I grew up in, we had a bodega around the corner. They spoke only Spanish. In fact, it was weird. I used to go. My grandma loved her beer and loved her cigarettes, and at 5 or 6 years old, I would walk around the corner to the bodega. I'd say, yes, this is for Doña Adela, my grandmother, and they'd give me 2 bottles of beer and a pack of cigarettes, ask no questions. And so when I went to college, I was like, what do you mean I can't buy beer? I've been buying beer all my life, But so the neighborhood was, my parents didn't have to speak English in the neighborhood because every store they went to, everyone spoke Spanish. And so, but yes, the politics of the island is an interesting dynamic, and it seems to change every once in a while. People shift from wanting to be independent to wanting to be a state to maintaining the Commonwealth status, I don't know where that's going to end up. Obviously Puerto Rico got decimated last year with hurricanes. It would have been nice to have more support from the United States. And I think it still finds itself, the island itself it should be a agricultural country, but in the 1940s and 50s, due to all these tax benefits, all these corporations went into Puerto Rico. And so a whole generation of Puerto Ricans grew up with no knowledge of living off the land. And then all those companies left, and now we're left with a huge unemployment and living basically on tourism. And so, the island is it's a beautiful place. I highly recommend anybody who wants to visit it, but it's a tough place. It's a tough place to live right now.
Was there a pronounced cultural shift going from New York and being surrounded by other Puerto Ricans to private school in Connecticut?
Yes. I didn't really know what to expect in living on campus. First of all, let me just say the idea of leaving home was not one that, my brothers, and I have to give a lot of credit to my siblings who were older. They understood that this was a huge break that I needed to take advantage of. I myself was not that interested in leaving home. I didn't want to leave my mom. I didn't want to leave my friends. I didn't want to leave my church. The idea of going and living at a boarding school was not, but my brothers convinced me to do it. And, I would say 2 things about boarding school. Obviously, it was a very affluent group of kids. But what's interesting in boarding school, where you don't have cars and it was hard to know. I couldn't tell you who was rich and who wasn't. The kids didn't seem to dress particularly wealthy. They wore Levi's, and I guess the clothes was expensive, but I didn't know it. It was Brooks Brothers, but I didn't know what that was. But since there was no way to judge, maybe some kids had stereos, but other than that, there was no way to knowing except for names. Like I do remember like my first football practice, I was in the huddle and the kids were introducing themselves, and this guy said, yeah, my name is, I think it was a Bill Firestone. I said, oh, that's funny, like the tires. He goes, yeah, that's my dad. And then the other guy's name was Goulden. I said, oh, well, like the mustard. Yep, that would be my dad. And then I there was a girl named Marika Mars Bars. And then I tutored Spanish to a girl named Liz Ford. Ford cars. So all the names were there. But because we were all in boarding school, because there was no way of kids demonstrating their wealth, I really didn't get a sense of how wealthy the kids were. And let me just say, to their credit, the kids were all very friendly. I mean, they knew that I was from the Bronx, but I felt treated, fairly well. Let me just say, there were a lot more drugs in prep school than I ever imagined. I was a pretty straight-laced kid, and I didn't do drugs. But when I got there, a lot of kids approached me and said, "Hey, can you can you access pot for me?" I was like, no idea. But they assumed, because I was from the Bronx, that I could get them drugs. So that, the culture shock was huge. Mostly it was a culture shock of leaving home, being in a very academically stressful environment. I mean, the amount of work that I had to put in prep school compared to what I did to get good grades in public schools was different. And so for me, dealing with being away from my family, away from my friends was probably the hardest part. And then adjusting to the level of academics. The kids, I have to give them credit. I felt, the kids treated me well. They had some preconceived notions of kids from the inner city. And I think I never found it to be malicious. I think, like with a lot of things, it's just, they never met a kid from the Bronx. So they had their preconceived ideas of what that meant, gang member or drug user, which were none of, I was far from any of that. And they learned that quickly, I think. So.
It's really interesting. I think phenomenon that goes on is a lot of the times there are preconceived notions of both kind of classes, I guess. Middle class is kind of disappearing rapidly, but the extremely wealthy and people from the inner city. And in my experience, I've kind of almost found those to be flipped. I went to a really good public school. I'm grew up in the suburbs, went to nice suburban cushiony schools, and then I came to Notre Dame, which is similarly prestigious, not quite Harvard level, but lots of wealthy people here, lots of big names, and I've never been surrounded by more technically illegal behavior than when I was around the extremely wealthy, which I find a really interesting kind of flip on things.
Yeah, it was weird. I mean, I didn't do drugs in the Bronx. I'd never seen the guys I hung out with, we were all into sports, and then when I got to Hotchkiss, I saw my first bong. I had no idea what it was. Kids were doing drugs left and right. It was, and like I said, it was just a new world. And but as rich as those kids were, I really never noticed until, maybe like spring break, I would hear where they were going for spring break versus where I was going. And then, you'd realize, okay, these kids might be pretty rich. But at the school itself, there were no signs of that other than maybe some kids having nicer stereos than others. And I had this really thick, it's funny. I had this really thick Bronx accent. Like instead of ask, I used to say axe a lot. And those kids got me out of that. And I think, I never felt bad about it. I never felt like I was being teased, but they constantly corrected my English, and that was fine because I needed to learn how to speak proper English. And, the teachers were super supportive, I thought. I think it was weird because I had skipped 8th grade in public school. So I came in as a 10th grader. And in retrospect, my parents wouldn't have known this or anybody, but if I had to do it again, I would have gone back and started as a 9th grader in high school. But the experience was, I went there with a goal. I knew what I had to do. So after the first 6 months, I got accustomed to being away from home. And then I just got down to, my job there was just to get good grades. And that's what I focused on. And, I did that at school, and I look forward to going home. I had a couple of close friends, but, my social life and all the things I cared about were still back at home.
And did you feel any pressure to succeed from your family, or just kind of to prove yourself, I guess, like knowing you're not there because of money, you're there because of academic abilities you've already showcased. Did you feel any pressure to keep that up there?
I just felt pressure to do well. I mean, for myself, I think I really understood that this was like my ticket, and that was mostly my brothers told me that, and so I went there with a goal. You know, I knew at an early age I wanted to go to medical school. Reasons I don't know why, but so I was very goal oriented. I went there and I said, okay, if I get good grades here, I'm going to get into a really good college, and that was it. I didn't feel super. You know, I had a lot of support at home. You know, like when I left prep school, you know, as I said, I went to this all Spanish speaking small little church, and to this day I'll never forget this. You know, at the weekend I was about to leave, you know how the church they bring you up to the front, let's pray for Dave Rios, he's going off, and they handed me an envelope, and in that envelope was $302, all singles, and the ladies society, the Las Damas, they had collected that as a gift to me, you know. And I was, you know, I mean, these were people that were not in a position to be giving money away, you know. That church was full of, you know, poor, low income folks. But, you know, they took some pride in the fact that I was going there. And, you know, I had just tons of support there. I had tons of support at home. You know, everybody was incredibly proud. And so I'm not sure if that put any pressure on me, but I certainly didn't want to, you know, come back, you know, be sent back.
And did your time in Connecticut, do you think, help prepare you for going to Harvard, or was that another culture shock?
So that's interesting. Academically, it should have, right? I mean, this was like a premier prep school. I should have been super well prepared academically. What I wasn't prepared for was the social side of being in college. And so at Hotchkiss, I was one of two Puerto Rican kids. When I got to Harvard, there were all these other Puerto Rican kids. You know, there were a bunch of kids just like me, and that was just really refreshing. But it kind of threw me off, and you know, let me just say, my first year at Harvard was a struggle academically, not because I didn't have the skills, but because the balance of the social life, I had to work, study, so I had to work, and the academics, I just never, you know, some kids, got to Harvard and did that well. I struggled through my first year, and I almost wouldn't ask back. You know, it was touch and go. Harvard was the other thing with Harvard is now I was back in the city. You know, at Hotchkiss I was out in the country, and you know it was very controlled, and now I was back in the city, which I loved. I had all this freedom. I had to figure out how to balance that. So the academics wasn't the issue for me. It was actually balancing, like, wow, there's a social life. I have people like me, and figuring out how to do all that, and then being surrounded by a bunch of really, there were some really smart people at Harvard. Like, you know, like this guy's, you know, I meet some people. I say, okay, that guy's a genius. But there were mostly a lot of people that had studied really hard and knew how to, you know, get A's. Not necessarily super bright, but really good students. And that's what Harvard was, like 95%. And then there were 5% that were you talk to them and go, oh, that guy or that gal is a genius, way out of my league.
There's this phenomenon called code switching that a lot of Black and Brown people have to exercise when they go into primarily Caucasian spaces, or that a lot of low-income people have to exercise when they go into a higher income area. And basically, code switching is just kind of representing yourself, almost creating like a different persona. Not necessarily, it kind of be like, do you have a phone voice where you like talk in a certain way when you're on the phone, or like your waitress or hostess at the restaurant, like that's her professional work voice. And it's kind of I guess a way to make people who aren't at ease in a particular environment like fit in that environment. So like Black people have to deal with this a lot with like, oh, you talk white, or like, you
Right.
don't sound Black. And, part of that is a persona that they've cultivated or have grown up in that kind of puts them at ease in an environment where they're not around people who look or speak like them. Was that something that you were struggling with your first year, is going from, a place where you had been in a mode where you were one of two Puerto Rican kids into a different place where you're in a city, there's other people who look like you, there's a lot going on. Did you struggle to find a balance?
Yeah, I think I did. I mean, one thing I did when I got to Harvard is I surrounded myself with other minority students. I mean, that's who I hung out with. Like everybody I hung out with was either Black, Mexican, or Puerto Rican. I had very few, and I loved it. Like, I mean, I thrived in that because, they got my jokes. I didn't have to change my jokes. I could sometimes, go back and forth from Spanish to English, and they would understand, so it was very, very comfortable. And that's what I surrounded myself with at Harvard. And it was great to have that. I think I did a little too much of that. And, it's just, I mean, I've given talks to kids going to college, and I lost focus and I think, especially as a minority, you have to realize that when you go to college, I mean, there's a lot of things out there. I mean, there's so many opportunities, but you can't forget that your job is really to get good grades, right? Because no matter what else you do, eventually you're going to be judged by your grades, right? If there's a racist professor, right, and you think that he's kind of, or she is sort of misgrading you, it's much easier to make that argument when you're a straight A student rather than you're a D student. So, I think as much as, you want to take advantage of like the Notre Dame and all the things that are out there, you cannot lose focus of, the basis. You really have to make sure that you do well, you get good grades, and then you do other things. But, and that's what I tell kids when I talk to them about college. I said, listen, there's going to be a lot of things coming at you. There's going to be the social life, there's going to be the politics, right? You get into the politics, of being Puerto Rican at school. You might, I joined the Puerto Rican Student Union and so on. But through all that, you got to remember that the bottom line is you're there to do well. And you always, if you're doing well, that puts you in a position of power when you negotiate and talk to people. And I kind of lost focus a little bit.
It happens to the best of us.
It does. Yeah.
So I'm Mexican, as most people who have watched any of this or talked to me for more than 5 seconds are aware. And we don't really have a college going culture. Mexicans don't generally. And it's not because, we don't value hard work or this or that. It's just, first there's the economic and social setbacks that Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and Black people deal with in a primarily Caucasian society. But, on top of that, kind of intertwined with that is, for a lot of Mexicans, it's more productive to go to work straight out of school, out of high school, make money so that you can contribute to your family's income, help pay the bills for your mom so that maybe she doesn't have to work 3 jobs. Maybe she's only working 2 now because you're bringing in income. And it's just that short-term payoff is more necessary than the longer-term payoff of paying money to go to college so that you can eventually make more money. Is there a similar phenomenon going on in the Puerto Rican community in your experience?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, I think the number of Puerto Ricans that go on to college is small. It's a small percentage. And it's mostly driven by economics. I mean, I think, if you cannot, get scholarship money or are willing to take loans, et cetera, it's much easier to get into the workforce and make money. And there's something to be said for that. You can help your family. There's some prestige in the community because you're now working and so on. Again, I was pretty lucky in that all my brothers, road had been laid out for me by all my older brothers, and my sister had gone to college, scholarships or whatever. So it was, it was never, and although my aunt and uncle, had a 7th grade and 3rd grade education, they understood and instilled in us early on that, your ticket out of the Bronx and your ticket to success is through education. And so there was never a doubt that I was going to go to college. And there was never a question from my brothers or sisters that we were going to go to college. Now, we had no idea how we were going to pay for it, but, we were going to get scholarships, we were going to work, we were going to owe money, but that's the way it was. And at least in our family, that's the way it was. But yeah, I agree. I mean, most of the kids in our church, didn't go to college. They went to work after high school. But, and I say this, and I don't say it in a joking manner. I mean, for all its issues, the United States is not a bad place to grow up. There are opportunities there. You got to go after them, but the opportunity is there. You can't, more than any. I don't know. I've never lived anywhere else, but don't get me wrong. This country has a lot of issues, but for brown people and black people and people like me, I don't think I would have had the opportunities anywhere else in the world than here in the United States. So
I have to throw in a small plug and embarrass you just a little bit. You are one of the major reasons that I was able to go to school where I went to school. So thank you for that. But I think it goes to a bigger phenomenon besides just embarrassing you, which I mean is always a plus. That the reason that representation and increasing diversity in schools is so important is because we help each other out as well. I mean, you helped lay the groundwork for me, and in the hopes that when I succeed with this elite education that you help provide me, I will be able to do that for other Black and brown kids. And like you said, your siblings all went to college and kind of left a roadmap for you. I have been helping my brother, who's a freshman at Mizzou this year, kind of navigate his first year in college because, been there, done that. And I think that's maybe something that doesn't get talked about as much in the diversity representation discussion. I mean, yes, it's great to build an inclusive community where all points of view are being held, but opening the door a crack allows us to open it wider for people who come
absolutely I mean it's all about paying it forward, I think. So the opportunity to help you was a no-brainer. You're a smart Latina woman who had an opportunity to go to one of the best universities in the world, and there was no way that I was gonna sit back and say, oh, it's too bad that you can't do that when I could help. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat. And, and I think you're right. You'll pay it forward with your brother, with other people, with things like this. And I think that's what makes it a little different when you're Latino and you go to college and you reach a certain level. I think all of us always feel, at least in my family, we've always felt that, we were lucky to have this, and our job now is to pay it forward. Just like, my aunt and uncle, right? Growing up, I didn't know I was poor. I mean, I was in the Bronx. I had everything I ever wanted. And this was on a salary of a janitor and a nurse's aide. And not till I went to Hotchkiss did I realize that I was not rich. I thought I was very rich. But, but they sacrificed, for me. And, I'm lucky now that I can, take care of my kids, but,
and other people's kids.
And other people, well, and people that I think are exceptional.
Which I think is great because you didn't actually know me that well, but now you're basically.
Let me say,
now you're basically my dad.
Your mother is very proud of you.
He talks about it a lot to everyone, but I think that's an aspect of our communities, respective communities, that I'm most proud of. I think is the idea that we're constantly laying the groundwork for the next generation to be better than us. It's cooperative rather than competitive, which is a change. You know, I have a lot of very wealthy Caucasian friends who aren't really that close with their families, immediate or extended, because they're constantly in a one-upping competition
Yeah.
who can be the most successful for like your own reasons. And so being a part of a
It's a
community
different
where
culture. It really is. Like, you know, like I never in a million years thought anything. It's like my kids want to go to college, I will pay for their college. And if they go to medical school, I will pay for that. Let me tell you, I have partners that if their kids didn't get a scholarship to college, they weren't good. I mean, these are doctors that make a shitload of money. And I was like, you know, I hear this kind of like, you're not going to pay for your kids' college? Why? You know, I mean, so anyway, it's just a different, maybe it's a different culture. It's a different, but you know, uh, it's part of our upbringing. And even in college and medical school, you know, again, in medical school, I gravitated to my best friend was Mexican, and you know, but it was cooperative. You know, we helped each other, and we helped the guys behind us coming through, like, and and um, and that's what got me through medical school. So.
well, we're all glad that it did. So, okay, so you came from the Bronx and then went to Connecticut and then to Boston and then to Stanford and then back to Kansas City. So you've been in a variety of different
Yeah.
American cultures. You've been in, you know, fancy privilege and more urban areas, and now you're settled in the nice Midwestern culture. What
White
are
state,
the
red state.
yeah, yay. What are the benefits and drawbacks of each, do you think? Like personally and as a Puerto Rican?
So for me, you know, the biggest drawback of being in Kansas was missing my community, right? Like, you know, like I said, I miss Puerto Rican food. I miss, you know, I miss my siblings, and I miss a community. I miss a bigger Puerto Rican community, no doubt. Having said that, you know, I spent time in San Francisco and I spent time in Boston, and those were great cities. And I grew up in New York. But truthfully, to raise a family, you know, the Midwest turned out to be a great place to raise my kids and have them, you know, succeed. Um, Now I had to adapt to being in Kansas. You know, like I don't speak politics very often with anybody because, you know, this is a very red state. I really don't speak religion very much with anybody. You know, so the way I adapt, and this is with people that don't know me, I stick to very superficial topics. You know, how those Chiefs doing? Yeah, that's a safe topic. So so for me, it took adapting because of my, you know, adapting to being in the Midwest, and you know, people in terms of my experience here, you know, other than knowing by my last name, I think people don't know where I'm from, you know. And so when I see patients, you know, sometimes they ask me if I'm Mexican. Some people have asked me if I'm Jewish. You know, they don't know. But you know, I've had some experiences here in the Midwest, especially when I did outreach in small towns, where you know, you get the odd question like, "So Rios, what kind of name is that?" You know, and I said, "Well, I was born in New York City. It's American."
Nice evasion.
Yeah. And then I said my parents were born in Puerto Rico, and you know, so I mean, people, you know, everybody has their way of kind of asking their question, you know, like you know, whether I went to medical school in the United States or not, and things like that. That comes up. It used to come up more when I worked in Johnson County, you know, at Research
Yep.
Medical Center in the middle of the inner city. Nobody gives a hoot.
So super interesting parallel. Very glad you brought it up. I talked to my neighbor, Dr. Berrigan King now, CLO, who's a dentist and from Mexico, and she kind of illustrated how, you know, a lot of her white patients will sometimes question her expertise, but she's found that she's able to build a stronger bond with her Spanish speaking patients because she's able to talk to them in their native language. Um, do you find it, one, do you run into challenges serving white clientele as a doctor? And two, do you have stronger bonds with your patients of color because you're also of color?
So interesting. So a lot of the sort of Caucasian patients, right? They tend to kind of look you up before they come see you, right? They Google. And so I have the advantage of when they Google my name, they see Harvard and Stanford. And that pretty much legitimizes me in their view. So I rarely get questioned anything. And that has nothing to do with me personally. It's just, people are impressed by those names. I could be, shitty doctor around, but they are very impressed by those names. And hence that gives me legitimacy amongst the Johnson County crowd. Now, in my practice, patients that I see that don't speak English, you can almost see like this wave of relief that comes over their face. Again, has nothing to do with whether they think I'm a good doctor or not. But when I walk in there and I speak to them in Spanish, it's like you can almost see them relax. Like, oh my God, I can actually, communicate with this person and tell them what I'm feeling and not have to kind of figure out or sign language or write or use a blue phone with an interpreter. And it's just a huge difference. It's always been that way. Even in medical school, the my in as a medical student was when I was, I did a lot of my rotations at San Jose hospitals, which had a big Mexican community. And so, they needed somebody to interpret, like they call Rios from the back of the pack as a medical student. And, so being able to speak Spanish to your patient who only speaks Spanish is, it's an instant bond, even if they're Mexican or Guatemala, it doesn't matter. But if they can understand what I'm saying, and even in my Spanish right now is a mess, especially when it comes to like trying to speak medical Spanish, but they don't care. They are so relieved. And like I said, it's almost physical. You can see it. So yeah, it makes a huge difference, I think.
So this goes towards a couple things. One, the need for diversity in all professions, but particularly professions that have such important effects. Like you're a doctor, your work affects people's health. And so being able to connect with your patients, to get them to trust you, to trust the advice that you're giving, to be able to know what they're actually experiencing is super important. And also kind of plays into, I think, the lack of diversity plays into kind of the distrust that people of color have with fancy professions like the medical field. And it's, really unfortunate that all of these implicit biases, particularly against Black people, Black women, kind of have such a serious effect. The mortality rate for Black mothers giving birth is like 3 times the mortality rate for white mothers. And so, having Black doctors, Black women doctors being able to come in and understand what their patients are going through.
I'll tell you, in any profession, and you'll see this when you, as an attorney, when you can bond with someone over the culture, and it, it just, I don't even know how to explain it, but there's like, like when I go into a room and it's an older Hispanic woman, instead of referring to her as a señora so-and-so, I call her, if her first name is Maria, I say Doña Maria. And, that's the way I grew up, referring to the older people that were my parents' friends. But that's like, they look at you like, I haven't been called Doña anybody in ages, but they like it. They're like, wow, that reminds me of, my home. And so, little things like that go a long ways. And if you can understand, you can bond over what kind of food you eat or, their diet. I mean, it just makes a huge difference in that interaction. And if they, the fact that you respect where they're from, you understand where they're from, you understand their concerns sometimes, those people remind me of all the people that I grew up with in my church, And so it's a big difference. But, you mentioned there's a big distrust of medicine, and that plays into this whole COVID thing. I mean, there's a lot of Hispanics out there that are very fearful of this vaccine, based on no, scientific data, but just an implicit sort of distrust of the medical field. And part of the job of those of us that are Hispanic in the medical community is to try to convince people that it's safe and that it's beneficial, because the reason that this virus is affecting Hispanic communities and Black communities is because of all the comorbidities that all the diabetes and the hypertension and all this and the obesity. These are the patients that don't do well when they get infected. And so that's and because the social things, like usually grandma lives with a lot of families, their grandma lives with the parents and the kids, and there's just no way of there's a lot of issues.
A couple of quick points in here. So I realize that some people watching this might not know the difference between doña and señora, which is totally fair. So like originally doña and don are Spanish terms for kind of like nobility, like lord and lady. Don Quixote.
Right.
Which total sidetrack, but like nobility and wealth are totally divorced from each other in Europe, especially. So like Don Quixote's broke, but he's from a noble family, so he gets to be called Don Quixote, which I think is great. But Don and Doña were originally reserved for the nobility, and since then have kind of been adopted as terms of respect and endearment for the older members of Latino communities. Senora is just like, senora is like correct, but it's very formal, I guess.
It doesn't feel right sometimes.
It doesn't vibe. Like a cute little old lady, she's a senora, but she's like react more warmly to doña.
Yeah, and that's why I use it, because it's very much for me, my way of showing respect for my older patients that are Hispanic. And I think they appreciate it. And you're right, like the señora doesn't roll off my tongue right. And especially if they have a hyphenated last name, that's like a long, so the doña and don just make it easier.
Yes. Okay. Second of all, I think kind of a misconception, unfortunately, is that a lot of immigrants in general that can't speak English, not just Spanish-speaking immigrants, but immigrants in general who can't speak English, are dealing with kind of a double whammy in society. They're dealing with having to go through interpreters or struggle through a second language. But they're, with that is kind of this assumption that people are uneducated or unintelligent because you can't fluently converse in the native language, even though the US doesn't have an official language. I would like to reiterate that for anybody listening, the United States of America does not have an official language. Thank you. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Okay. But, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because not only are you struggling to communicate what you're going through, you're also coming up against this perception that you're uneducated or don't know what you're talking about just because you can't fluently communicate in English in this country. So just like to stress again how important it is to have doctors of various languages, cultures, backgrounds, being able to talk to their patients and understand what they are feeling so that they can better treat their symptoms. Medical care is sometimes less than optimal for non-English speaking patients, and that's not a reflection on the doctor. That's just a reflection on this language barrier that, a person isn't adequately able to describe their symptoms. Lots of things get lost in translation. It's really difficult it's impossible to translate word for word and get the meaning correctly between Spanish and English.
I think a lot of things happen in that situation. If you are thinking that someone needs a procedure and now you have to explain it to someone, and it has to be an interpreter and they don't understand, all these, that becomes a barrier, So maybe some doctors will be less likely to, because that takes extra time, right? sitting down and explain that through an interpreter, that's another 30 minutes of your day. Whereas if it was an English speaking patient, it'd be a 5-minute discussion. So, that results in less care or less optimal care, I think. And so, and it's at all levels. It's just not the doc. I mean, we need people that, at all levels of law, all levels of medicine, nursing, physical therapy, all those times, because this is a problem across the board.
Absolutely. And something that you mentioned a little bit earlier was COVID having a disproportionate effect on Black and Brown communities due to a lot of underlying health conditions. And I think, that's just like another factor to keep in mind, is that Black and Brown people who are more likely to live in lower income situations. And when you're from a lower income household, you can't spend $5 on broccoli for half a meal when you can spend $5 at McDonald's and feed 5 people. And so you're more prone to underlying health conditions, which makes you more likely to need medical attention. And because of your income status, less able to receive medical care, to follow up on procedures, to pay for your medication, to have insurance that lowers, your copay enough to be able to go to the doctor. There's, a lot of factors that affect Black and Brown people's ability to go to a doctor, trust a doctor, follow up, do their proper follow-ups, pay for proper procedures, pay for proper medication, take the medication like they're supposed to. And sometimes you just can't abstain from environmental risks that you're advised against.
It's extremely complex taking care of patients, Black, Brown, that are from a low income community, just because, sometimes they have to decide between food and medicine. I mean, it becomes that simple. And, so even if they want to get their medicines, sometimes they can't. And sometimes they can't come to doctor's appointments because there's a copay. It's just, to me, the medicine is actually the easier part. It's the social part that is and it's also important not to get frustrated as a physician and take it out on your patients. Like, why aren't you taking the medicines I prescribed? It's like, well, I can't afford the medicine you prescribed.
Right.
I got to eat, or my kid has to eat. So, it's just having said that, I've never been happier than working where I am. I've worked in Johnson County. I've worked with research. Just let me say, I walked in there and it felt like home. It's just like the faces of the people walking through that hospital reminded me of all the people I grew up with. And so and the people that worked there reminded me of the people I grew up with. And so I was like, wow, this is where I belong.
Well, we're very happy to have you. I'd also like to take a second to highlight how diverse Research's cardiology group is. So my mom is a nurse at Research's cardiology office, and she works for Dr. Lawrence, who is Black, and we have Dr. Rios, who's Puerto Rican, and Dr. Weisberg is Jewish, and Dr. Deepak is Indian.
It's a very diverse group.
A lot of diversity, and you see that reflected in their patient pool, and that's really important because when you're in a low income area already, you're going uphill socially. You're dealing with distrust of the medical field. So if you can go into a doctor's office where people look like you, it just makes it so much easier to work with patients, to get them to trust what you're telling them, trust the medication that you're prescribing, and just lays a foundation for a really healthy doctor-patient relationship.
Yeah, I agree.
Yay for that. Want to get your quick opinion on this. So we're dealing with a lot of things that are making it difficult to convince Black and Brown communities to get the COVID vaccine, but more than that, to find COVID vaccine availability. Mm-hmm. It's not rolling out as smoothly as it should in Black and Brown communities, especially when you consider that Black and Brown communities are disproportionately affected by COVID. Prime example of this is the recent investigation going on in Florida, because the county commissioner at Governor DeSantis's, under Governor DeSantis's kind of declaration of how they were going to deal with the COVID vaccine, created a VIP list of people and handpicked zip codes that would be getting the COVID vaccine. And surprise, surprise, they were the two wealthiest zip codes in Florida. And the VIP list included herself and some of her friends. So lots of things to unpack there. First of all, you have people saying that we don't need the vaccine here because we have the lowest rate of COVID transmission. Yes, you are in a very wealthy zip code, and that plays into why you have such a low rate of transmission. Florida's numbers are a little dodgy to begin with due to some political back and forth that's going on about data. But what it boils down to at the very base is that a Caucasian county commissioner on a all Caucasian county commission board at the request of a Caucasian governor made the decision to make the COVID vaccine available only to the two wealthiest zip codes in Florida, which are shockingly primarily Caucasian. So just wanted to get a quick opinion on that. Quick little comment.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, it's like anything else, right? In this country, right? Money helps, right? And that's going to be the case in even with this rollout of the COVID vaccinations. I don't have a great sense of how that's rolling out here in Kansas City. I have my patients have come by and I've asked a lot of them just today, just to get a feel for, how many of them are going to get vaccinated, and if they are, how easy has it been? And surprisingly, I was very happy. Just about all of my elderly, and today it's just mostly African-American patients, all were, 100% going to get vaccinated. And we're actively, aggressively seeking out, sites. I was pretty impressed by how aggressive and how resourceful they've been. I don't think it's an easy, a lot of it is online registering. Not everybody has a computer, I'm sure trying to get things on the phone. So I don't have a great sense of how it's rolling out in sort of Jackson County where I work. But I was impressed by, one lady was getting it through her church. The Truman Medical Center, another medical center that serves an inner city community, is providing. I don't know what research itself is doing in terms of the community. I kind of have to look into that. But I think here in the Midwest, I think the rollout has been a little slow, but it's picking up, and I think I don't get the sense that people are jumping lines or getting referred care. Granted, in some area codes it's just more efficient because they have more money and can do it better, and everybody in that area code has a computer and it can log on.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, I can testify that Missouri's rollout is going significantly better than Indiana's.
Good to hear.
I'm eligible for the vaccine in Missouri. I'm not eligible for the vaccine in Indiana. So
you gotta come home.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. All right. Well, our hour's about up. Are there any last minute topics you would like to touch on, or are we good to go?
No, I just want to thank you for having me. As I was surprised you wanted to talk to me, but I'm happy.
Thank you for coming. Of course, I want to talk to you. You're wonderful and incredibly impressive, and I love you. I'm going to sign off, as I always do, with a quote from Claudia Flores. We must be impatient for change. Let us remember that our voice is a precious gift, and we must use it.
The program is brought to you by the Kansas City Business Association.